And so I just want to talk a minute about the nebulous nature of what folk means. So it's something we think a lot about at the museum. In fact, we just starting in a couple of weeks is our inaugural curator of folk and self-taught art at the museum. And my colleague in the Art of the Americas, Noni Gatson, has thought about it for a long time as well. So there's a spectrum of training, as John said, in the folk realm. There's a spectrum of skill applied to whatever art form an individual chooses to put their hand to. So we see on your far left an instrument that looks violinish, right? If you looked at it quickly, you wouldn't be able to tell that something was odd. But if you keep looking at it, you'll see that the lower bout, so the lower section of the violin, is actually quite a bit larger than the upper bout, and that's not the same, right, as a European form. But does that matter? This is an individual who's not known to us now. But was obviously needed to make a violin for their own purposes or for the purposes of those around them, and used whatever models they had, if any, to construct a violin that worked. And this is a violin that worked, and it's a New England imagination, a New England ingenuity that becomes manifest. The center image is an example of an instrument where the proportions are a little bit closer in terms of upper bout and lower bout, but still quite, if you were to use a Cremonese or a European model, you might say it's rough. But it has this kind of wonderful decorative element that whoever put their hand to this chose to adorn it with inlaid mother of pearl and to carve this intricate tailpiece out of bone. And then the final example I've chosen here is of a violin where we're really seeing an imaginative belly. So that's the top of a violin. So you can see that the edges are almost like a ravioli. Has anybody ever made ravioli? When you fill the ravioli, you press down the edges, right? And you have a flat area around the edges. So that's what you have here, and quite an arch coming off of that flat area where you have the spinach and the ricotta and everything else that comes with ravioli. So these are just some examples of violins that were likely made for one's own use or for the use of those around them. And just to say that folk art is amazing and incredible in its own right. So
So another example of that is by a New Hampshire native called Pickering, who worked near Portsmouth, New Hampshire. He was born 1804, died 1858. He was a cabinet maker, according to the 1850 census, and he made bass viols. He made violins. This 1843 instrument, I think, is very cool because it's starting to have, you just saw a bunch of folks instruments, but this is starting to have some of the dimensions of loosely of a modern violin. And the insides of it, which unfortunately you can't see here, are starting to be like what we would think of as a modern violin. There would be blocks, there would be lining, the neck would be set with a mortise. So it's a really cool instrument. If you want to, but it is definitely American, right? It's going to be a little overbuilt, perhaps. The corners are a little bit stubby, and it's definitely American violin. And they're using this for dance tunes, and so why don't we hear how it?
Music that Marina's going to play. It's from my research at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester. And while I was at the Antiquarian Society, I had a great experience going through their manuscript collection. So, of course, I went there and I said, hello, I'm looking for music to match with these wonderful instruments that are at the MFA Boston. And so I'm thinking, okay, so we've got this violin from New Hampshire. Let's see what I can find in terms of music manuscripts for violin in that area. And one of the most fascinating things I found was basically like a gig book for a violinist. So if you were a violinist at this time, you played for dances and parties, this was like kind of your fake book. So it was about this big. It was little, and I was astonished because I went up to the reference desk and I'm like, I want to page this book. This woman comes back with this tiny little book, and the cover was leather. All of the pages were worn soft. You could really tell that it was an object that had been used and perhaps stashed in one's pocket. Now, a popular way to take your violin or fiddle around at the time was to put it in your pocket. So I just immediately, upon seeing this manuscript, was like, oh, that's right. Violin goes in the right pocket, your book goes in the left pocket, you're set, you're ready to throw down. So I selected kind of a party tune for Maria from this fascinating manuscript, and it's called Happy Bacchanalian.
So again, yeah, that sounded great. Thank you, Maria, for that. So again, that's homegrown New England sound. New England invented, solving the problems of churches, solving the problem of entertainment, dancing, this was built at the time of, in Europe there were Amadis, Stradivari's, Guarneri's. But look, in the United States, we're doing our own thing, and we're proud of it. Okay, so that kind of describes how the kind of U.S. Native instrument making, and how it began, and where it ended up. But interesting, from the time 1800 to 1900s, there were a lot of changes in New England. There are a lot of changes in the United States, and that would change violin making. And essentially, what's happening in the United States at this time, there's an incredible amount of wealth coming into the country. If you look at the United States GDP in 1800, we would be like ranked, I don't know, 20th or something. We'd be someplace, near Indonesia and Pakistan. Very small. Up top would be France and would be the UK. If you looked 50 years later at 1850, where we would rank, it would be amazing. Because we all of a sudden went up, and all of a sudden our GDP, our economy, was almost the same size as the UK and of France. These great, European powers. And if you then go ahead to 1900, wow, we are bigger. We're like 30% bigger. We've become the dominant country in terms of GDP and economy in the world. And so this brought vast amount of changes to the United States. There was money coming into the United States. New England in particular is really cool. We don't think about it, but New England was the energy capital of the United States at the time. Why? Because of whaling. There was no coal, there was no kerosene, it was whale oil. And we created it. We had hundreds of ships in New England going out and finding this. But we also had the world of industrialization. You had textile mills. The cotton gin was, invented here. You had steam engines, iron power, iron smelting. So again, it's the go-go times in the United States. And as a result of all this wealth in the United States, there was a lot of the music industry. All this wealth attracted the music industry. And it attracted the music industry, and it grew the music industry not only in the United States, but if you're a European performer, all of a sudden you thought, I might have a whole new audience base across that ocean in the United States. You see all this movement towards increasing classical music at this time. Orchestras were started. The New York Philharmonic started right at this time, 1842. The BSO started 1881. Chicago Symphony, 1891. All during this time to capture this you know, the BSO was created to give music and make it accessible to everyone. So it had these great notions of bringing music to everyone. Music publishing also was thriving. In Boston, you had two publishers, Elias Howe, Oliver Ditson, that became very well known and became powerhouse music publishers in the United States. Conservatories were starting in the United States. You had NEC, started in 1853. And also, but most importantly, for violin making and for the development of violins, you started having soloists come to the United States. Soloists who would never imagine thinking of going across, I mean, it's not an easy trip to go across the Atlantic Ocean. You know, why would you play in the United States? But because of the wealth and because of what we're creating here, soloists starting to come over. Soloists like Artaud and Ole Bull and Henry Wouton. And these soloists came over not only with their skills, but they came over with their violins. And that was intriguing for American luthiers at that time. And so, all of a sudden, New England was going under a big change, where all of a sudden you had globalization, and you had new technology coming to the United States because of these musicians. Now, the first New Englander to be exposed to violin technology from abroad was Ira White. And what made Ira White really special was that not only did he absorb this technology, but he passed it on to others, who then kind of created a New England violin making tradition. Ira White was born 1813, kind of in Bear, west of Worcester, kind of near the Quabbin Reservoir. His father was a violin maker. Now this is kind of in dispute. A lot of people wonder if was he really a violin maker or was he not? But I think he is. Why? Because we recently found a violin made by his father, so maybe it helps you know, add some light to whether or not he made violins or not. Ira was very mechanical. He was reputed to be able to fix anything. And the first time he touched a violin, though, was his brother. His brother led a dance band in Boston. But one day he came back with a mangled violin and just absolutely thrashed. And he told Ira, hey, if you can fix this violin, you could keep it. Well, Ira worked on it. He fixed the violin, but his brother took it back. You know, he didn't have it. But he was determined to build a violin on his own, so he built one in secret, in the attic. And when his dad found out that he wasn't doing his farming duties, but instead built a violin, what did he do? He actually said, oh my God, this is so awesome. You are so talented. You need to go to Boston and build violins. So they sent him off to Boston. In fact, the whole family kind of goes to Boston to support him. In 1835, which is the violin to the left, this is his kind of first creation. This is before he's seen fancy, European instruments yet. It's kind of loosely modeled over maybe over German or Saxon violins that might be imported. It's kind of, to me, it has looks like a Steiner violin a little bit. But his really big breakthrough for Ira came when Alexander Artaud, the Belgian violinist, comes to America. And this in America was a big deal. This is like the Beatles coming to America, except, he's just one, so he's a Beatle. A Beatle comes to America. And he packs houses, everyone comes out to listen to him. And Artaud plays up and down the East Coast, a whole series of concerts. And he brings a Strad with him and a Guarneri. And Ira, being a well-known luthier at the time, needed to adjust his violin. So Ira becomes friends with Artaud, and Artaud lets him study and measure the violins. So Ira White got to spend time with the violins, measured it carefully, and from that time on, you can see that he started to change how he approached his own violin. Prior to Artaud, you see the violin to the left, Post Artaud, you see the violin to the right. And there it is. It's increasingly sophisticated. Now, unfortunately, Artaud gets a lung infection while in the United States, and he actually never recovers. He ends up going back to, he never recovers. But the impact he made in New England will stay forever. What Ira White also did that was really important, though, was not only did he keep the information for himself, but he passed it along to others. So Ira White ended up teaching his brother, Asa Warren White, how to make violins. And they, in fact, then taught E.F. Bryant, who taught O.H. Bryant, who then taught a whole bunch of American makers. And many, many American makers and New England makers came out of this White school of violin making. And so, why don't we hear a little bit on what a White violin sounds like?
So John just spoke about Alexander Artaud, who was really such a pivotal figure in introducing Cremonese violins to an American maker, one of the best American makers of the time. And Artaud was one of these star violinists who performed a lot of his own compositions, and that was kind of his shtick, was writing these virtuosic solo pieces and then performing himself, much like Paganini, for example. So Maria is going to play a little excerpt of one of those for us. From the same year, it was programmed in Boston the same year that Ira White copied the violin.
Came from players, and New England makers were able to take a look at that. But technology transfer also came from other methods as well, and one of those methods was immigration. The United States was a melting pot for people to immigrate, and sometimes these immigrants came with incredible skills, with master level skills. So let's talk about the story of George Gamunder, who you can see here, over here. George Gamunder was born in 1816 in Germany. He was born halfway in between Frankfurt and Munich. And what was interesting was his dad was a violin maker. His dad was the violin maker of a court for a prince in Germany. And his then the dad raised all their kids to be violin makers as well. Now George later on kind of disses his dad a little bit and says his dad wasn't that good. But they're exposed to violin making. And in fact, when George was 12, the family received a quartet of Stradivari instruments. So George Gamunder, at the age of 12, is looking at a quartet, which is two violins, a viola, and a cello, of Stradivari instruments, and that's his first exposure. The dad eventually dies. George then travels around Austria and Germany, working for notable German luthiers. So he's really getting trained. But his big break comes from when he goes to Paris, and he applied for an internship or to be an apprentice of Jean-Baptiste Viol. And Viol is, at this time, the most influential maker and dealer and repairer in the world. He's located in Paris. He did amazing things like there's this guy, Tarisio, who kind of collected 144 Cremonese instruments Stradivarius's, Guarneri's. Viol bought them all, spent a fortune, bought them all. And he had 144 of the very, very best violins. That Viol then became kind of a nexus. If you had a good instrument, you brought it to Viol to repair. If you're an amazing player, you all roads went through the Viol workshop in France. And so George Gamunder kind of gets this big break. And at first, Viol almost doesn't want him when he realizes the guy doesn't speak French. But because he was skilled and he was good, he accepts him, and he starts working as an apprentice in Germany. And that, how Gamunder, he knows what awesome sounds like. Why? Because he's surrounded by these incredible instruments every single day, and he's taught by the best luthier in the world at that time. In fact, Ole Bull, who was kind of the Picasso, not Picasso, the Paganini of the era, goes to Viol to get a repair, and Viol says that he has a assistant who's German who could actually do a better job than he. Ole Bull then interviews Gamunder and allows it, and that's how. And then Gamunder does an amazing job fixing this instrument. He not only learns how to make and repair violins, but he actually learns how to run a violin business at the time. And then Viol has 4 keys to running a great violin business. 1, and a lot of these make sense today. 1, hire the very best people you can. 2, organize to produce something consistently. That's the definition of a brand, by the way, a consistent package of goods. 3, buy old wood, and at whatever the price. If it's good wood, you want to buy it. And lastly, which you might say this is good or bad, Viol started antiquing his violins. In other words, to make the violins look like the Cremonese instruments, they would take a new violin and make it look like an old violin. And that, though, was really popular, and he sold a lot of instruments that way. Gamunder, after years of apprentices, wanted to leave. He wanted to travel, and he was thinking about going to the United States. But Viol actually talks him out of it and says, it's a pity to waste a talent like yours in a place like the United States. So he stays a little bit longer, but eventually he does leave. His brothers at this time have gone to the United States, and he goes to follow them. Why? We don't know. Perhaps his ego is getting big and he's tired of being just a person in the workshop. Perhaps he was advised by Ole Bull to go, because Ole Bull was really into the United States. Anyway, he packs up, he leaves. When he lands in the United States, he becomes the most trained luthier in the United States. Nobody, not even Ira White, has the exposure to great instruments and the training to be, from the master maker of the time than George Gamunder. Now, of course, no one really appreciated that. He ends up in Springfield, Massachusetts, playing in a quartet, which was also not appreciated. So then he comes back to Boston, and he said, all right, I'm gonna make violins, I'm gonna repair violins. So he had starting capital of $25. He sold violins for $50 a piece. He did repairs really, really cheap. On the side, he built a quartet of instruments, though, and he sent them to London to the Great Exhibition. Now, this is an exhibition of the best technology at the time, run by Prince Albert. And he sent a quartet of instruments, and what do you know? He wins top honors, maximum distinction. Louis Spohr, Vuitton, and other really qualified judges his instruments, and it's deemed to do really well. He then says, look, Boston is too small for me. He ends up going to New York, and he ends up in Astoria, Queens, where another amazing music company, Steinway Piano, also ends up. And and then you have, he spends his rest of his career over there. But he came to Boston first, and what's amazing is he built a violin in 1849 when he first arrived in the States using American wood and with a style that's distinctly his. It's not a copy. It's very different from the other work that he's done before, and we are fortunate to have that violin with us today. So let's hear a little bit from a George Gamunder, the best violin maker in the United States. The moment he arrives here.
A little introduction. So a lot of what I was thinking about in my own research into violins has to do with performers and who the personalities were who were trotting these instruments out, and also new repertoire, and in this case, a commission. Also, in the course of doing this research on early American stringed instruments, I thought, well, I'm a woman and I'm not a person of color, so where are we in this picture, And when we were planning this event, Bobby and John and Maria and Kevin and I were kind of sitting around looking at all these instruments and thinking about what to present to you today, which instruments to play, what music, and Kevin said, oh, didn't Maud Powell play a Gamunder? And I made a note, okay, I'm gonna look into that later. So what I found out, Kevin, is that, did you know that Maud Powell actually played 2 Gamunders?
No, I didn't.
Okay, so this is totally fascinating. First, who's Maud Powell? Maud Powell was the first American-born woman to really make it as a star violinist. That's huge. She was born in 1867, and she gave the US premieres of concertos by Tchaikovsky, Sibelius, and Dvorak. I mean, these are the big pieces in the violin concerto repertoire. So, we should know her name and talk about her. So I was fascinated to find out that she played her first Gamunder as a student, took it to Europe where she went to study, and then later in her career, she was very famous. She was playing on all kinds of great violins, and she was sold an instrument that she thought was a Guadagnini, and then after her death, it was actually revealed to be a Gamunder. So without even knowing it, Maud Powell went full circle and ended up with a violin that she was crazy about that was actually by George Gamunder, the same guy that she kind of started out on his instrument. So that's a huge credit to him that people believed that this truly was an old Cremonese instrument. So one fascinating thing about Maud Powell is that she commissioned a concerto from Samuel Coleridge Taylor, a Black British composer. And in the context of the MFA, when we talk about a sinking ocean liner, we're usually talking about the Lusitania, because there's the whole Leslie Lindsay Mason collection here that's dedicated to the memory of a woman who perished on a sinking ocean liner. What I found out looking into this piece by Samuel Coleridge Taylor is that when he sent the parts in the score over from Britain to the United States, he sent them on the Titanic. Spoiler alert, they didn't make it. So he had to rewrite the entire piece on very short notice in order to make the premiere at the Norfolk Festival in Connecticut. So thanks, Kevin, for the tip. This was fascinating to look into. Okay, let's hear an accent, Maria.